Yes. Excellent. So this is Owens Lake in 1913. This is taken from probably at the bottom of the range front, the Sierra, near Cottonwood Creek. Cottonwood Creek, you pass over Cottonwood Creek when you drive on Highway 395. It is almost always dry. In very wet years or when work is being done on the aqueduct, sometimes water is released into it. So Owens Lake is a terminal lake, as is Mono. It's a place where rivers end, but off and on through millennia, it was uh, it was much fuller and at times virtually dry, um, because you're talking about I don't know, a quarter of a million years or so. Um, this is the way it looked in 1913, and the water went all the way across to where the little village of Keeler is right now. All right, here we go. This was Patsiata in 2023. 2023, we had over 300% precipitation in the Sierra, definitely down here at the south end. The city of Los Angeles did not know, they were at their wits' end. They did not know what to do with all this water. They gave water to everybody that was supposed to get water. They gave water to everybody that their time for water had expired. They just extended it and sent them water. But in the end, they had to release lots of water into the Owens River. And the water, those molecules from the Pacific Ocean were able to go where they used to go, which was Owens Lake, Patsiata. In this photograph, um, you can get the impression that the lake was completely full, which it wasn't. The lake actually was about, on the surface level, was about 50% covered, about 6% of the volume of water that it would take to actually fill the lake to where it was in 1913. But it was amazing. It was huge. Um, I know that Jeff McQuilkin and his family paddled on it. I was lucky to paddle on it a couple of times and just go out into it. And it was just amazing, filled with brine shrimp. Um, had an algal bloom going. It was just amazing. A few birds thrown in also. Probably less than 10 feet. The lake, when it was full, historically, back when colonists arrived, was maybe 50 feet deep, maybe as much as 60. Um, the evaporation rate is about 5 feet per year, 5 vertical feet per year. So the lake went away again um, um, in about 18 months or so. So now when you drive at 395, you look out there, you see there is water out there, but it's very little of it compared to what it was. This is the paddling. I got a call from a group of, well, actually, there's somebody that locals will may recognize. It's Peter Vorster. I keep wanting to point to the picture as if you can see my finger. Peter Vorster is that front paddler with that safari hat on, and I was told to sit in the front, and I was to talk for 3 hours about Owens Lake. So being a being a school teacher, talking a lot is no problem, and being the son of my mother, it's really no problem. Um, she was quite a chatty woman. So the fellow in the back is one of the river warriors. He works on the American River and those other rivers in California that run all the time and nice and big. But there were Friends of the River people there, policy directors, Peter Forster in the safari hat, the hydrologist who has worked off and on for Mono Lake Committee for many, many years, and others. It was just an amazing day. That is a replica canoe, a freight canoe of voyageurs up in French Canada. Um, it's 25 feet long and it'll hold 10 people, 5 rows of side by side. It's just amazing. So I could kind of stand up and turn around and then sit facing backwards. And we just carried on a 3 hour conversation out there. It was quite amazing. That's Lone Pine Peak behind us, that tall peak. And to the right of it, somewhere would have been Mount Whitney. So Owens Lake was at times fresh water. During the glaciations, the lake was up to 300 feet deep. Um, it was overflowing to the south. It carved Fossil Falls, another place that you pass by on Highway 395 south of Olancha. It's a volcanic flow, like in Hawaii. You can actually see the flow coming down off the slopes. It crossed where the river was and was eventually carved by the overflow of Owens Lake. It went on to China Lake, where Ridgecrest is, the city of Ridgecrest, then over into Cyril's Lake, where the town of Trona is, and then into Panamint Valley. And eventually, at the really highest levels of glaciation, it filled up Death Valley with a lake that was 90 miles long and 600 feet deep. Just incredible. Lake Manly. People paddled on that in 2023. It was in the wire services all over. I never made it because I'm kind of focused on Owens Lake. But these are snails, ram's horn snails. They have the curve like a ram, the little ones, and the big ones are freshwater mussels, which are they're 3 to 4 inches long. Um, the same species that occur currently in California. The big ones are sometimes called California floaters. Um, but that was an important food source for people that were living here, the people before the New Moon or the Paiute, the people that made the petroglyphs that the New Moon referred to as the people who were before us. Um, and it was very important. So there are places around Owens Lake where you can find um, these amazing places where you get a little glimpse of the past. We also had Tufa, where there were springs around the lake. This one is about 3 feet across, 3 feet in diameter. At Owens Lake, the Tufa were formed as part of kind of a thin uh, bacteria, algal kind of organism, those kinds that are hard to define sometimes, that can photosynthesize and they grow on the surface of things like a rock or a log or something. And there are locations around Owens Lake, especially on the west side, where there are more springs because of the snow melt of the mountains and glaciation in the past. Um, but they're amazing. They're really quite incredible. They make me think of stromatolites, uh, which go way back, way back, although they're still in existence as well. So this is the Annual Mountains in the distance, and this is the cloud of sandpipers, western and least sandpipers, and just meant to uh, give a feel for the number of birds that over time relied on Owens Lake as a place to stop and rest and refuel. I think David Gaines would call it, like a service station, these lakes. These are marathon migrants. They uh, they will go hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles at one time. So they don't just go to the next yard or the next valley, but they might go from here up to uh, the Stillwater area out of Fallon and Reno. They might go to Honey Lake, but they can go just hundreds and hundreds of miles. But they need tremendous amounts of fat. I mean, a lot of fat, like the phalaropes here at Mono. They need to virtually double their body weight in fat. Um, they've shrunk their organs, their interior organs. Um, they can just digest that fat straight into their system without virtually without a stomach at that time, and can just cover huge distances. It's the part of nature that's called awe and wonder, um, because I tell kids, students, that awe and wonder is what you're looking for. That is what we need to find. We need to find that in nature, which is easy to find in nature. And we need to find that in people we meet also. We need to be struck by certain people on what they do or what they say and wonder, because those are the things that really stick with us. Everything else is just kind of ideas and words, and it's deciduous. You know, it falls off over time. The people that came before the Paiute, the Numu, um, we don't really, I don't think we really have a name for them. We have archaeology that looked at them. These are people that did not use the bow and arrow. That kind of came with the Numu people, the Paiute. They used that throwing spear, that atlatl. Um, but they lived in this area as seasonally moving and hunting and gathering. It's Owens Lake in the distance, looking north up the Owens Valley. And there's in the foreground on the left is a mortar hole, um, where seed gatherers could grind things and uh, and set things aside, live on currently, and then get things through the hungry months of winter when they would be telling stories. That's when you tell stories in the winter. So after the native folks came, the indigenous people, miners came. These are people that are looking for wealth. That's their motivation. Their motivation isn't necessarily humanity or the betterment of society. They're just looking to get rich quick. And so above Owens Lake in the Inyo Mountains, in the 1860s was a silver strike, initially by some Mexicans, and um, and eventually, of course, by colonizers, um, that took it over. Usually, when debts couldn't be paid, like Victor Baudry, who had the store originally at Fort Independence with soldiers, but when the strike came for silver at Cerro Gordo, he moved his store up there, and often people couldn't pay; they'd be in debt, and he slowly accumulated title to many of the claims. This is Cerro Gordo itself. Um, these, again, I'm pointing, these, I want to call them, well, these tram buckets, whatever they might be called. This was probably during the zinc period, which is after the silver period. The zinc period was the turn of the last century, around World War One, and they ran a tram from 8,000 feet up in the Inyos here to Keeler, down at the edge and shore of Owens Lake. That one large building, well, there's two large buildings, but that one large building that's closest to the center is a little bit, about 10 o'clock from the center, is the American Hotel. That was the oldest building still standing in Inyo County, built in 1870, that unfortunately burned just a few years ago, and now has been rebuilt. But we lost what we had. Um, it was really a sad moment. There were boats on the lake at times because the ore was very rich. Um, it was high grade ore. There wasn't a lot of it, it turned out. I mean, the mining for the really rich stuff was less than 10 years, and that's typical with these kinds of mines. So they had to send the ore somewhere else to get it refined. So they crushed it, they smelted it, um, they made their own charcoal up in the Inyo Mountains. They had uh, charcoal makers out with mules and burros out there cutting down pinyon trees and making charcoal in holes in the ground. Um, and they came up with bars that were about 80 pounds. They were about half and half silver and lead. Um, and then they had to get them to San Pedro because at San Pedro, and there's no train at that time, there were only Remy Dideau's uh, mule wagons, freight wagons that were continuous north and south into the Owens Valley. They hauled those bars down to San Pedro, put them on steamers that went up to San Francisco Bay, San Francisco, and to where there was a refinery that could separate out the silver and the lead. I find that just amazing in the 1870s, the effort. But this is big money at the time, at least when it was making money. I mean, you're talking about money from San Francisco, Chicago, New York, the same kind of places that you can find money today. So this is one of the steamers. It was propeller driven, and they operated for just a few years in the 1870s. They would save 3 days on the trip of getting the silver bars down to San Pedro. Um, Going through, it's hard to imagine, but taking those bars on a freight wagon with mules around the end of Owens Lake through sand took them virtually 3 days to get it down to the south end of the lake. Well, they could save those 3 days by getting the bars down to where Cartago is today, where Crystal Geyser has its water bottling plant, using one of these boats. Everybody back in those times, post Civil War, was a colonel, right? I mean, whether you were ever in the army or not, you were a colonel because that's that's just how you got your way through society at that time and got your creds and all that stuff. So Colonel Stevens, a New Yorker who came west with the gold rush, ended up in this area um, and decided that he saw money in the need for lumber and charcoal at Cerro Gordo because he was one of the ones like Levi Strauss and others that made money by selling things to the miners. You need a wheelbarrow, you need a shovel, you need food, whatever. Well, so he built this sawmill above Lone Pine um, uh, on Cottonwood Creek at about close to 9 to 10,000 feet, and put a steam driven mill in there, and built a 9 mile long wooden flume, and they would shoot the lumber down to the shore of Owens Lake, where there were two charcoal kilns that are still there today with a historical marker. And they would make charcoal, and they'd also have lumber for beams and things to do the bracing that you kind of do in underground work. So this is the Stevens sawmill. There's boards from that flume still in the canyon along the trail, square nails that are almost 6 inches long. Um, Unfortunately, in the 1960s, some vandals burned the mill. This is pre-mid 1960s, but there's still remnants of it. You can walk around and kind of get the feel of it. Ranchers followed, of course, because you could you had to raise food to feed these miners. Um, the uh, Cerro Gordo mine, which lasted during the 1870s, eventually morphed into mine strike silver at Darwin and the Coso Mountains. So there was always somebody to feed. And of course, you had to have a brewery in Lone Pine. So there's a brewery street, and they're making beer by the barrel and other food, fresh food, things like that for the miners. Don't these animals look intelligent? Especially the one in the middle with a straw. Looks like my Uncle Charlie. He's always crying how poor the farmers were when he drive to the bank in his Lincoln. That was, you know, we would all chuckle, even as kids. Um, uh, does look a little bit like Uncle Charlie. Um, there was a regional artist that lived in Lone Pine named Charlotte Skinner, and she had married Bill Skinner. And there are still Skinners in Lone Pine. She had met him at art school in San Francisco, and she wasn't from the Owens Valley, but she came back because Bill had to come back and do something. I think he still did do art and whatnot, painting mainly, and maybe some sculpture. But he was a miner and he was from a ranching family, and so they lived in Lone Pine until I think the 1920s or 30s when they left the valley, or Bill died and Charlotte left. But they were well connected with artists at the time. There's a house in Lone Pine called the Skinner House um, that's still there, and people like Maynard Dixon were friends of theirs, especially Charlotte. So Maynard Dixon came to Lone Pine to paint the Inyo Mountains and paint the deserts and things around Keeler. And in 1919, he stayed with the Skinners. He came in 1929 as well. Um, and his paintings are out there in collections and museums throughout the country. And he was married to Dorothea Lange, who also was alone. So she has some photos of the Little Pine area, Bill Skinner and others, um, doing the work she did as a photographer. This is my favorite um, because I've been on Owens Lake for so long. I've spent decades out there. I'm going to try to describe it to you. Um, Charlotte must have painted this. This was painted on just a board, and it's in oils. And I believe this is in the Owens River Delta. These are willow trees, the trees around there. You can see the puddled water as the river met the lake. The lake is in the background, in the middle. And then behind it, you can see the sunshine on the Alabama hills. And then you can see the tall ridge of the Sierra. And Nancy and I know every bump on that ridge. That's Wanoga Peak, that tallest one, which is just off of what's called the Horseshoe Meadow Road that takes you up into the Cottonwood Lakes Basin. This is just such a beautiful painting. 1906. That's about the time LA started smelling water. You know, they were running out of water in Los Angeles. They had, I don't know, they had 20, 30, 40,000 people. And they had just tapped out all the water that they had down there. And one of the guys was a friend of Mulholland's, the former mayor of the city, Fred Eaton, who was kind of a silver spoon Pasadena guy, but they had ranching aspects. You know, it was kind of Teddy Roosevelt era. You know, you could read Greek and also saddle a horse, kind of thing, and box. Very important. Those skills are coming back, apparently. Um, Anyhow, Fred Eaton knew the Owens Valley, and he knew all these streams that came down, and they flowed all year long. And so he did that famous trip about this time, 1905, I think. He and Mulholland and came up to the Owens Valley, and he showed them where they how much water there was, and that a ditch could be dug, and by gravity they could take water to Los Angeles, and all their friends and neighbors could make a great deal of money. That's enough for Los Angeles. There, Bunker Hill. It's hard to believe that was at one time covered with Victorian houses, beautiful Victorian houses, some of which have been saved and moved to Heritage Park. I think I was at a meeting with DWP with this one. Jeff knows those. There it is. There's the bottle, for God's sakes. Um, these bottles were passed out when the water arrived, and Bill Mulholland did his famous speech about there it is, take it. He said much more than that. They also had an opera singer there, a very famous opera singer, who sang a song about water, and, the glory of civilization and banking and things like that. Um, so they also passed out a pennant, a flannel pennant about the arrival of the water in November of 1913. And Nancy and I donated one of these bottles and a pennant because I kind of had Stockholm syndrome. I was an adversary of Los Angeles for 35 years or something. Um, I kind of started collecting aqueduct things and water things in the Eastern Seaboard. You know, I some people do drugs. I I I I collect my captives. I collect things about them. So I donated. Nancy and I donated a framed bottle and a pennant that I happened to get. I mean, this is collecting over 30 or 40 years. But one of these we donated to your museum here in Lone Pine and Lee Vining. Um, one of these bottles. It's really cool. Souvenir first water from Los Angeles Aqueduct, November 5th, 1913. This is where it arrives. This is what you see when you're driving the 5 north before you turn off on the 14 to go up Santa Clarita. Um, this water coming down the hill that it's sometimes cascading and there's lights on it at night is the second aqueduct, the one that most people don't know about. It is the modern water war. It's the one that I was involved in. Um, it wasn't the 1913 one. That aqueduct there coming down that hillside was finished in 1970. And that's when Los Angeles said, we're going to take all of the water we can get out of the Mono Basin. They disconnected irrigation on 8,500 acres in the Owens Valley, just dried it up. And they put in a massive groundwater pumping system that still exists today in the Owens Valley. So that's the second aqueduct. The first aqueduct is on the left, that upper left corner, where the bottom strand of barbed wire kind of goes by kind of a green structure. Looks like it has a window or something. That's where the water came out in 1913. And this is where they had the big ceremony with the bottle, the opera singer, the pennant. Um, I'm sure lots of food to eat and lots of celebration. But it still isn't enough in a day in a time when things are changing climate-wise on our planet. This photo was the 5th year of the drought we had from 2011 to 2016. This is the aqueduct just south of Alancha, and no water went south to LA from April to November that year. There were so many what Los Angeles refers to as obligations. We've referred to them as obligations also. There were so many water obligations that there was no water left to send south. Water needed to remain in the Mono Basin to some degree. Water had to be kept in the Owens River Gorge, where a pipe accidentally broke in 1991 and water went over the edge. Mono, Mono said, there's probably fish in there. We're going to have to decide how much water is going to stay in that gorge. And so they saved that. The Inyo County Los Angeles Water Agreement, 1991, that dealt with management of land and groundwater pumping, and Owens Lake. So times can squeeze us. But when the aqueduct took the water, Los Angeles bought so much land. They started by buying land just at the south end of the valley, Lone Pine Independence, and they said that they only wanted to take their share, and there'd be enough for everybody. Maybe there'd even be a reservoir someday. But because they had all the water the city would ever need, that's what the headlines said. So In the 20s, 10 years later, they were back for more because it wasn't enough. They were already still short. So they started buying all the land and canal companies up in Big Pine and Bishop. And so these are leftover silos from some of the farms. You see these around Big Pine and Bishop. This is a sad photograph of the lake and especially that cow. Got out on the lake bed when it was muddy and got a leg caught in the mud and couldn't get out. But that horror of that cow and the environmental horror of that lake bed kind of fit together. This is looking north. Owens Lake sometimes turns red because of really primitive organisms, photosynthetic organisms that only live in hypersaline water. And they live in saline lakes all over the planet. So if you're in Asia, if you're in Turkey, if you're in South America, you can see this phenomenon. These are extremophiles, they're called. So the lake as itself, as a resource, began to be taken advantage of. This is remnants of a table salt operation that actually collected table salts, sodium chloride, from Saline Valley to the east of the Owens Valley, which has a salt pan at 1,100 feet elevation. They brought it with a tram over an 8,000-foot ridge of the Inyo Mountains and down to the edge of Owens Lake where the narrow gauge train was. And then it could be shipped out. This is kind of the World War I era, lasted for about 3 to 4 years. In more modern times, this one started in the 50s and closed down in about around 1970. This is the Pittsburgh Plate and Glass building or factory. This was called by locals PPG, employed a lot of people at one time. It's still there. You see it on 395 south of Lone Pine, down at the edge of the lake. They were after soda ash. They would drill holes and wells and get the brine from under the lake. This is a massive one that existed for almost half a century over near Keeler. This is the Natural Soda Products, or NSP, and the remains of the plant are still there, and lots of litter, a large lime pile. This is where the highway goes from Death Valley through Keeler into Lone Pine. And there's some of the housing at the top of the picture. I had a friend who's now gone in Lone Pine. He grew up out here. Uh, he said that's where the Mexicans lived, up there, all those small shacks. And his family, when they came out in 1925, and he was 4 months old, to Cartago, um, because they had an uncle there that had a job. Um, he said we lived with the Mexicans. You know, they came out with the flivver from Kentucky, and in '29 the stock market crashed. That plant closed down, but this one opened up bigger, and his uncle got a job, and his dad got a job there, and so he grew up there. Eventually, uh, went away to school after World War II, became a physician, did his whole career in Lone Pine. Don Christensen, wonderful, wonderful guy. He'd pack when he was a kid growing up. He'd pack with the Packers in the summer, and then have to go to school during the rest of the year. This is near Cartago, which is by Alancha, close to right next to where Crystal Geyser has their water bottling plant. This was the plant that existed in the 20s up until the crash. The closest housing there at the bottom of this photo, they're still there. Some really nice housing left over that's still there from that period. They also were after brine. Those are evaporation ponds on the other side of the factory. So the lake's water was mostly gone, except for seeps and springs around the edges where birds would trickle in during migration. We started counting them in the 80s. But the dust began to blow on a regional level. This was the single largest dust source from one location in the entire United States. So this was the one that Los Angeles eventually was uh, told, I guess, ordered to fix the dust at Owens Lake. This is one of our group meetings out to the lake. You can see it was kind of a windy day, so there was a lot of dust around, but not too bad. Nancy and I went through the real bad days in the 80s and 90s where you could barely see across the street in Lone Pine. It was just an utter brownout, and you couldn't see mountains on either side from in town. But these are DWP people, environmentalists, ranchers, and others, scientists, journalists, having a meeting trying to decide, well, how are they going to fix this dust? With lots of big machines, some of which the lake swallowed. Um, these are large scale excavators, and a number of these were just swallowed by the lake in the mud to where they had to bring out giant timbers cabled together that the rescue vehicle could get out there where they could try to pull and save these million dollar machines. What's neat is that in the middle, it's hard to see. They're just dots, a couple of dots. Are American avocets. They're already beginning to show up when LA began to spread some water up there to control the dust. This really says it all. Um, Los Angeles was under the gun to fix this dust in a reasonable period of time, and if they missed deadlines, they would be fined, which sometimes eventually added up over years into millions of dollars that was spent on relieving air and dust related problems locally. But these are Wilson's phalaropes swimming in a pond of water was meant to control dust. And then behind it are the machines that created that habitat. Now, these birds used to come when Owens Lake was there naturally. Now they're back because the main tool by Los Angeles to control the dust is water, either to grow plants, shallow flood, or actually ponds. This is Owens Lake, 15 miles roughly long, north to south, about 10 miles wide. If you look at all these polygons that are at the north end, the polygons on the east side, and then down to the south, those are the cells, the dust control cells, where they were ordered to fix the dust and to use these different methods. The brine pool that flooded in 2023 is that middle area that's very white and there's no polygons. It doesn't produce dust. It's often damp, and the crystals, the particular crystals that grow there, that kind of salt is a hardened salt. It isn't that fluffy stuff that blows with the wind. They began to farm on the moon. They tried it. They brought in people that work in agriculture, and they could only use plants that were native, regional, and they had to leach the land. They put in perforated pipe below to drain away the brine. They plumbed it with a different kind of bird, a rain bird, and grew. This is saltgrass, and then and over time, other things came in, different grasses, even with aqueduct water, because all this water is straight out of the LA aqueduct, a 60-inch diameter pipe that brings water by gravity down to the surface of the lake. And so in it sometimes are seeds, good seeds like willows and cottonwoods and rushes and sedges and things. Sometimes not good things like saltseed or tamarisk. They're also trying tillage, which they can do in clay soils at the south end of the lake because they want a clod that's going to really last for several years. These furrows are not like your vegetable garden. These furrows are at least waist deep, maybe chest deep And the idea is to slow the speed of the wind at the surface. If they can lower the speed of the wind to 20 miles per hour or less, the dust won't come up. And so that has been working, although they had violations 2 years ago in April when the wind off those Sierra in the distance was 100 miles an hour. Um, it dried out some of those ridges, and they had a dust exceedance and had to pay for it, much to their disappointment. In the distance is shallow flooding like this. All these plants here are not planted. These are plants that are growing from seed that came with the water from the aqueduct. South of Lone Pine is a little RV park called Boulder Creek RV Park. And right across the highway towards the Sierra, buried in the ground, is a 60-inch diameter pipe plumbed right into the side of the aqueduct. It was kind of our revenge on Mulholland in a sense. These are the same kind of critters that you'd have up here at Mono. These are the pupae shells or skeletons of the alkali fly, and this is the food that they live on. The lake was inoculated in a sense that all the wet areas, the seeps and the springs, sometimes artesian wells, these are just small postage stamp, 1 acre, 2 acre size places. Um, they had all of the food web in those locations. And what I mean is they had the primitive filmy algae mat that grew right on the soil, the primary producers. They had the flies that lay their eggs on the algae and their larvae feed on the algae. And then the table is set. The birds come in because they want to eat these and other things as well. So as soon as water went out there in 2001 in November, um, things began to grow. Algae began to grow because this stuff blows around. Um, Flies began to grow. And in spring of 2002, there were American avocets nesting on every horizontal surface that was on Owens Lake, every road, which was very inconvenient. They were trying to learn whether they could move them, they could maybe a foot at a time, or maybe 3 feet at a time, get it off to the edge so all the trucks, tractors could go by. All of the crews working out there and the contractors were all getting snowy plover training. They had to be certified. They had to have a sticker on their hard hat because that was the bird we were most concerned about. Species of special concern, the snowy plover. These are brine flies and a couple of ruddy turnstones that showed up migrating through Owens Lake. The amount of food there is just beyond measure. It's just train loads of food and fat. This sign was actually on the lake for a few years. In 2001, the lake became an important bird area for Audubon. This is a flock of avocets, coots on the water, and there's one curlew in there, long-billed curlew as well. Um, a neat photo because at the top, you can see kind of on the top of the screen on the left-hand side is kind of a small quarry, rock quarry. And to the right of it, you see some horizontal layers that are going. Those are old beaches of Owens Lake. All of the rocks are skippers, they're all flat. And then in the layers, you find some of the snails. So, you know, that was a high stand of the lake. When the lake actually had fish, it was fresh water, it was overflowing. Just amazing history around the lake. These are least sandpipers. One of the reasons that Owens Lake was able to become part of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, that's a mouthful, which is an international group that also includes Mono Lake and other super places. It extends from the Arctic Ocean all the way to Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, the very cream of the crop for shorebirds, either for migration, for nesting, and so on. Owens Lake joined that elite group in 2018. One of the reasons, because you have to pass their criteria. You have to have some pretty superb numbers. We had large numbers of least sandpipers, 2 to 3% of the entire population. We had large numbers of American avocets. Oh, there we go. There we go. The ones at the top, the big mob flying, are American avocets. We had maybe 3% of the entire population of avocets using Owens Lake. We counted over 20,000 in a single day. Amazing, amazing thing. And then we had snowy plovers. Oops. These are avocets just cruising. They're ready to come down. They got their wings set, legs out the back. Sometimes if they want like the flaps on an airplane coming down, they'll lower their feet just a little bit. So you can occasionally you'll see one with their feet starting to come down, lift their head up. This is my office. Usually there's several coffee cups, a pair of binoculars, and maybe half a sandwich or something. Um, there's a lot of hours and days that people have spent out there. I couldn't even begin to count mine. I've been doing official type counts, beyond my own notebook on sheets, data sheets for any organization that would take them um, since the 1990s, early 90s. We have an Owens Lake Bird Festival. We just had it in April. It's a small, humble bird festival, but we have field trips and all kinds of great things that happen every year, so you can look for it. It's hosted by Friends of the Inyo at friendsoftheinyo.org. People like to watch birds, either in their backyard or out in the wild. For the Dust Project, Los Angeles had to get a lease to use the land because the land belongs to California. It's managed by the State Lands Commission for all of us. I took a PowerPoint to Sacramento years ago, and I did a presentation showing birds as far as you could see to the staff of the State Lands Commission, saying these birds are on your land that you manage for all of us. And we need to make sure that we understand what you're doing to help these birds. Because working with Los Angeles at that particular time, we were kind of patted on the head. That's why I'm pretty thin up here. And told this is not a wildlife project. This is a dust project. Well, through working with state lands, they put language for bird monitoring and habitat value and things like that in the lease, educated by Audubon. And then they had to get a permit from Fish and Wildlife, California, and they put language in there as well. So that's how he kind of got protection. The elephant in the room was the Public Trust Doctrine decision 1983 for Mono Lake that said Los Angeles may have permission to use the water, but the wildlife belongs to all the people of California. They have to be balanced. There has to be a mechanism to balance them. So in a sense, rather than being in court, which we would have ended up if it had gone the wrong way, um, we just tried to balance it as best we could ourselves. So we have over 20,000 acres of habitat out there, some ponded, shallow and deep, some with islands, some vegetation, um, but just thousands and thousands of acres out there now that are being managed for dust as well as habitat. This is a historical photo from back in the aqueduct building days. I was curious because I identified these. These are all northern shovelers. Today, hunters won't even shoot those because they don't taste good. They taste like mud. Um, but anyhow, this is a handsome man there with all of his dead ducks. Maybe he's going to do pate canard or something. Okay. Wonderful birds come. This is a black tern, one of my favorites. It's a tern that doesn't dive. It picks things off the surface. These are just gorgeous birds. Long-billed curlews, they nest north of us in the grasslands of Nevada, Utah, Montana, up into Canada. So last slide. The uncertainty at Owens Lake currently is climate. What climate's going to do? If things really get bad in terms of snowfall and things like that in the Sierra, when it's desperate times and people are up against the wall, they can make terrible decisions. They can make decisions like the governor saying it's an emergency and this water has to all go to Los Angeles now. Can't be going for these birds, just like Delta smelt and things like that. So the concern with climate is real. The other is that Los Angeles, and this is no surprise, they want to save water. I mean, they're in the water business. They want to deliver water. They want it to be as cheap as they can and pure. They would love to pump water from under Owens Lake up onto the surface for dust so they could not use that water from the aqueducts. They wouldn't be using aqueduct water, which is the sweet stuff. So these are 3 monitoring wells. There's more than a dozen of these sites around the lake. There's 2 large production wells, large casings that are out there for a pump test that Los Angeles Department of Water and Power would like to do. They want to see how the water behaves if they turn those large pumps on for several months. We're concerned about what's going to do too. We're concerned about the quality of that water in terms of habitat and birds. One of these will go down 500 feet, one will go down 1,000, another one will go down 1,500 feet. That's just the surface of the sediment. The sediment here is 8 to 10,000 feet deep before you hit solid rock. So there's many years. If you want to find the tuff from Long Valley, that pyroclastic layer, it's down 1,000 feet in Owens Lake. It's 770,000 years ago. You have to go down 1,000 feet to hit that layer. So the uncertainty about the pumping, the uncertainty about climate are the greatest concerns that I see for the future. Thank you. There will be a quiz. Thank you, Mike.
Many thanks for correcting the volume. It was a great presentation.
Yeah, my wife Ellen and I have lived here almost 20 years now, and I'm continually astounded about all the new things I learn. And Mike, so much more tonight to be learned. Thank you so much. Okay, any questions in the room? Just start with. Well, yeah, it's it's several different kinds of salts.
I think in the mic.
Did you get to finish your question? She needs to finish your question.
No, I'm
Okay. Once more.
Alkali and salt and more. I mean, there's
sometimes there can be organic molecules that are attached to it.
I'm going to talk to the people online. The question is, what is the makeup of the dust, the chemical makeup? Go ahead. Yeah, why don't you come back over here?
Some of you may still have homework tonight. I don't know. I don't want to keep you too late. So the question was, what is, I think, the nature of the particles that are blowing? So these are aerosol particles, they're windborne. There are numerous kinds of salts at Owens Lake chemically, ones that involve the alkali metals that we learned about in chemistry, sodium and potassium, magnesium, and them. But sometimes there can be organics attached to them, and sometimes there can be metals like nickel, arsenic. Those are some of the more common ones, especially arsenic. There's no good quantified data on the effect that these had on local people over years. There's anecdotal evidence, like when major dust storm, the ER at our local hospital in Lone Pine, or if it was a north wind, the ER in Ridgecrest, 80 miles to the south, would suddenly see many people with respiratory challenges, uh, people with asthma, kids with asthma, and they would be really coming in. We know with lab animals, we know with lab animals um, being forced to breathe these certain amounts for certain lengths of time, we know what they do to living systems within a mammal's body. Um, and it's not good. The particles are invisible. The dust we saw is not the dust that's the real hazard. The particles that are less than 10 microns and are less than 2.5 microns or so, human hair's 60 or 70 microns thick. So these are very, very, very small. They go into the deepest part of our lungs and they go right through cell membranes. They go into our bloodstream. And so you hope it's only salt, you know. Um, but it's fixed right now, I would say, other than exceptional situations. Well, questions here from the Zoom world. Uh, is it this question? Have brine shrimp adults been present every year, or do the eggs? Um, I read that brine shrimp they produce uh, this structure called a cyst to overwinter or go through dry periods. That they found some in some layer in some lake that I'm sorry I can't remember that they were able to see that age of that layer was 200 years and they germinated. I mean, not germinate, that's probably wrong. They're not plants, but they hatched. They hatched. So when I paddled out there in 2023, there were 3 brine shrimp per square inch. I swear to God, right up to the surface and as far down as you would go. And lots of green and algae bloom because they graze. They graze on that like they do here. Um, so the brine shrimp have been showing up in those dust control cells, those polygons, in the more brackish type water that they prefer, because they're kind of like Goldilocks organisms. They want water that's not too fresh and not too salty. They want it right in the middle, and that's when they flourish. So the salinity in many of these habitats has to be closely monitored because you need to have that Goldilocks water for shrimp, for flies, and then for the birds. Let's see if there's any more questions. Hope I can answer them. Thank you for the shrimp answer. I'll answer a question. How much water is used at Owens Lake to control the dust and create that wonderful habitat? When the water first came on for these square miles of dust control, wasn't habitat then, wasn't called habitat then. They were using somewhere in the mid 70s, 70,000 acre feet of water, which is a great deal of water. But you have to remember that the people have been breathing that dust for 80 years. What's the price tag on that? Um, Now it's down to about 60. Through efficiency, they have to, and they're required to maintain a habitat value that was set in 2012. Um, and they're not to go above or below that, more than 10%. So they have actually been able to save some water there, which is what they're looking for downtown. People up in the higher floors of the building on Hope Street, the DWP headquarters on Hope Street. Yeah.
In 2023, when the branch from hatched, water was pretty, 10 feet deep. Were there many birds that went down?
Yeah, it's a real good question. Um, there were not big rafts of birds out there. We saw some California gulls, some eared grebes, but in small numbers. A few ducks. As you got over to where the river entered, where there'd be more of a mix of water, a little bit less briny, more of a brackish, you got more birds, but you also got into shallow water where the birds could feed. They could walk through that, the avocets and others, and feed. The majority of birds since 2001 at Owens Lake are in the dust control habitat project. That's where they're at. Okay, are they managing the water for the depths for the birds, or is it just whatever it is when they turn it on? They aren't really doesn't really matter. Yes, yes. Oh God. You guys all look so tired. You look like school was out about an hour ago, um, and you haven't finished your homework. So um, the, there was not an organization, but there was a group established for Owens Lake, mainly through Audubon. I organized a field trip at Owens Lake in 2006 that I invited every stakeholder there was, state people, city people, county people, ranchers, miners, environmentalists, all, and had tremendous turnout. Had senior managers from all the agencies and the city. And the idea at that time, the concept I was looking for was a comprehensive management plan for the lake. Instead of looking at grazing there, dust there, minerals there. What that morphed into after a couple of years of meetings in Bishop was it morphed into um, the idea of not having a comprehensive management plan, but have a project. In this project, we had work groups on habitat, we had work groups on groundwater, we had work group on public access. I was in all of them. What we came up with, and you can find this if you go to ladwp.com, and up in the search box, put in Owens Lake birds, and you'll find what's called the master project, and it divides the birds up into guilds, birds that are diving birds, grebes and diving ducks. Um, it divides them up into shorebirds, waterfowls, nesting birds, plovers, and some shorebirds. And so those groups have certain habitat needs. All the polygons, we use a system called a habitat suitability model, um, which basically gives a value. There's a little bit of subjectivity in it, but it's about as good as you can get, I think. Um, it gives a value to all the things that are involved in a certain piece of habitat, like what is the salinity? When is the water there? How long is it there? How deep is it? Are there islands? Is there vegetation? All those kinds of things, all giving numerical values. Those values all have to be maintained, set. We accepted them at 2012. Um, uh, the baseline based on that 2012 data. And so those are all being looked after. And if something happens bad or pipe breaks or whatever, it has to be fixed, and those areas have to be kind of reconstructed. Um, if water is saved, because this is part of the grand bargain, that if the city of Los Angeles would commit to um, uh, preserving habitat and enhancing it, then we would agree to talk about water efficiency and possibly saving some measure of water undetermined at the time. That was the grand bargain, is with the devil in a way. But it got us kind of down the road. So if water is safe, because there's parts of the lake out there where there's water every time you go by, and there's no birds, there's no flies, virtually every time you go there. So those are situations where maybe some of that water could be used to enhance existing areas that are doing really well, because the birds are talking to us. I mean, they're getting there with their wings. And they're saying these are the places we like. Our job is to figure out, well, what is it that makes this the place they chose? That's listening to nature, right? So some of the water could be used for that, and then some water could go south. And so far, they've only been able to save from maybe 20% of the water for them, from 75,000 acre feet to 60. Um, and that baseline of habitat value, which is over 20,000 acres as well, is still there, is holding. Oh, DWB question? Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question. What DWP will tell you is we are here forever. On just south of Keeler, on the east side of the lake, is their headquarters. It's where they have their control center, where the computer screens looks like Houston, the NASA rocket center, where they can look at everything. It's where they have all their equipment yards, all their shops and everything. Cost them $20 million 15 years ago to put in. They have created maybe 80 some odd jobs that are associated with the Dust Control Habitat Project. Those are permanent jobs. Um, so they're there. The law, which is the Clean Air Act of California and the federal one, they chose to, they were told by federal EPA, you can follow us, uh, the EPA for the United States with the United States Clean Air Act, or you can follow California's Clean Air Act and their EPA. DWP chose the state. And if they don't meet these lines of progress, if they don't do them correctly, if they aren't making, trying to keep people healthy and for us also the birds, then they are fined. And it had been up in the millions of dollars. That money went in to replace wood stoves in Mammoth and June Lake because the air pollution district is Inyo County, Morrow County, and Alpine County. So those millions of dollars went paved paved the dirt around the hospital in Lone Pine. Instead of having dirt to park the cars on, we actually have pavement now. It's what century are we in? So that money was well spent on Los Angeles's nickel. Yeah. Any other questions? Let's see. Yeah.
Somebody asked, I mentioned being detoured to Keeler when it got too dusty on 395 due to wind direction in the six more than once.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the questions the ranger got in Death Valley. Nancy and I heard this when we were over there because we lived with the Parkies. It was wonderful. Um, they would have people come into the visitor center in Death Valley National Park and they would say, does the wind always blow this way? You know what the ranger said? No, ma'am. Sometimes it blows the other way. So the wind, primarily the one that kills us, is a strong north wind or a strong south wind, often associated with big storms from Alaska, Gulf of Alaska, those big low pressures in the winter that come in and slam into the West Coast. Those were the ones that would get us. And so back in the 60s, certainly there were times where it wouldn't be safe to drive on the highway, even with your lights on, because you can't even see lights. It's worse than fog. It's worse than fog. So we had several accidents. I know right near Manzanar, we had an accident, multi-car accident. I don't think anyone was injured seriously. Um, and that one of the fire guys who's out there in the truck went to walk around to like get some gear, put some things away, and he walked right into his truck, walked right into the side of his truck. Um, it's really bad. Right now, because of the water agreement with Inyo County, there's a mitigation there where that dust came from called the Shepherd Creek alfalfa patch, which is where the elk are sometimes down near Manson. There's so much more I could say. Actually, you've woken up a little.
I think we need to stop.
The jokes are what do it.
All right, Mike, thank you very much. And you're super thing. Thank you.
Great job. Many thanks.
Okay, folks, that's it for tonight.